Good morning. I wanted to take a couple minutes as you prepare to write part 3 of your paper and just give you some general reminders based on the writing that I've seen so far in the other modules, and then specific things you want to focus on in your writing as you start the third paper. First of all, I'm really enjoying the conversations and the threads and some of the ideas that you have with the different technology and the different tools and apps and programs and software. Really some good stuff, and I hope you guys are learning from each other so they can help you in your classroom. Okay, so some general reminders as you start your third paper. First of all, the introduction. The introduction should be the shortest part of your paper. And then, especially in this part 3, you're basically saying who you are, where you teach, and your relationship to the teaching that you do in connection to the curriculum you're analyzing. And name the curriculum that you're going to be talking about in the paper. And that's basically it. And then you're moving on to the questions. Okay? Just based on the other papers, one statement I would make to you is this. Be sure you don't write so much in one section that it limits your comprehensive answer in another. So you got to balance how much you write in each section to be sure that you're able to answer each question in a meaningful way. Point number 3. When you construct your table of specification, and I think there's a video up on that I posted about that if you have questions about it, be sure you, in the beginning, you talk about what the table is, why we use those tables, and then maybe underneath the table you talk about what you learned about your curriculum in the creation of the table. So you show some analysis of the table. Again, that section about the table specification should be a fairly short section in relationship to the other ones, because the table will take up the space. But in the beginning, what the table is, why we use those tables, and then 1 or 2 things that you learned about your curriculum in the development of the table. Okay. Next. Of all the questions in this section, the one that probably creates the greatest challenge for students is answering the question, how does your curriculum use technology to address multicultural issues? So you can certainly talk about how your curriculum calls for the use of technology, programs, software, in different projects and activities that you do. And maybe even in those activities you're exploring, your kids are getting new ideas, new perspectives on different cultures, different backgrounds, different historical perspectives. That would be one layer of that question. Another one is multiculturalism is not only learning about other cultures and backgrounds, but also how you're creating, through the use of these the technology that you have and the tools you have kids use, how you're creating this idea of tolerance and acceptance and a culture of that in your classroom. For example, you may have kids certainly go out and search on the internet, for example, in a project. But instead of them doing it in isolation, they do it in groups, or they may do it in partners. when you're doing those things and those activities, you're creating this idea that we're working together. We tolerate, we have tolerance and acceptance of each other as we work together. That's reinforcing this idea of multiculturalism. So see if you can find elements and moments when that is happening. Either by the curriculum design itself, or is it teacher initiated? And then the last layer that sometimes is talked about is this idea of when we're meeting needs of special populations, whether it's learning disabled student or one that might be have hearing issues, where you might have to use a mic. When we're allowing students the ability to have access to your curriculum in the general education classroom, access and their ability to participate in activities and in the curriculum, that's also reinforcing this idea of multiculturalism, because other students are becoming more accepting of students that have different learning needs, and so are there technologies that they use may not being reinforced by the curriculum, but it's reinforced by their ability to participate in class. That again is creating that idea of acceptance and tolerance in your classroom. So think of it in those ways, and I think you'll be able to address that question with less frustration. Another point, be sure that when you're saying things in your paper, that there's just not random thoughts, but you're indeed citing sources of where you got your ideas. Certainly you can have your own ideas, but my point is when it's important to use other sources to support what you're saying, and if you're making random comments, it's important that you indicate where you're getting your ideas, if you've gotten them from other places. It's also important, you should be citing your curriculum guide inside your paper. When you're giving examples from the curriculum guide, or you're talking about things that are inside of it, it's important that you cite your curriculum guide. And for most of you, if not all of you, it would be the county is the author and the owner of that curriculum guide. So it might be Carroll County Public Schools, 2007, because that's when the curriculum guide was written. But make sure you're citing your curriculum guide. Another point, when you're discussing units, this is important. Don't just make a list of the elements that are in your curriculum guide. I don't want a list. What you want to do is take those elements that are in your curriculum guide and talk about them in a sentence format. You may not talk about every single element, but in connection to what Henson says should be in a unit plan, to what you see, and the most, the strongest elements, talk about them, and maybe even talk about ones that are missing, or elements that are weak. But don't just make a list, a long laundry list of elements that you see. I want you to talk about the elements so that I know that you're analyzing and thinking in a deeper way about those elements. Okay? If you don't have a unit plan, you need to talk about the elements that you think would be important, connected to what Henson talks about, if you were to develop your own units, and then why you think those are important. And you're going to separate. One part you'll talk about unit plans, and in the next part you talk about lesson plans. And when you talk about them, you want to talk about why lesson plans are important, what the essential elements should be in a lesson plan. You want to talk about whether your county or district requires a certain format for lesson plans, or is it up to the teacher to determine? If you have no lesson plans that are provided, talk about the lesson plan elements that you include and which ones are connected to what Henson says should be in a strong lesson plan. But again, make sure you're citing your curriculum guides and other sources to reinforce your ideas. Another point, when you're talking about the instructional models, information processing, inquiry-based, mastery learning, whatever they are, you want to make sure that you describe each one and the essential qualities that it has, and then how you see evidence of that in your curriculum, and provide specific examples when appropriate to reinforce the idea that that's how I'm making the connection to this specific model. But it's important when you're talking about these models, you're not going to be able to touch on every element inside those models, but take 2 or 3 of those elements and make the connection so that in a meaningful way. But again, you're not going to be able to talk about every single element of those models, but just how you see it most prevalent in your particular curriculum. Okay. I would say that another element that I didn't write here, when you talk about the important factors that impact the selection of your curriculum and content, again, you're not going to be able to talk about every factor, but make sure you talk about what the factor is and how you see evidence of it in your curriculum. And that's no different than in that particular section too. You're talking about national goal. If you're talking about national goals, well, you can talk about Common Core, okay, and those standards, but inside that, I would, what are your Common Core goals centered around? And how did they become so important to the development of your curriculum? But that's a separate issue. But I guess the point is, don't just mention something and then let it drop. Have some sentences that expand your ideas. And that goes to my next point. I want you to be succinct in your writing, but don't be so brief that it limits your thoroughness of your answer. A 2-sentence answer, and one of those sentences being a quote out of the book, is not an adequate answer when you're talking about these types of analytical and analytical questions where I'm asking you to go a little bit deeper. Then another point, you should, and I think I've already maybe talked about this, you should have more than one reference on your reference page. Henson's text should not be the only source that you have. In these kinds of papers and these kinds of classes, you're looking to have outside sources that reinforce your thoughts. And then I cannot emphasize this enough. There are essentially, after the introduction, I think there's 9 questions. But some of those questions have 2 and 3 parts to them. So I would go into the module and go down to the document that is a description of the assignment, and I would go through each question and make sure that you're answering each question. For example, I'm looking at it now, and the first question says, how does your curriculum prepare students to be information literate? And then, how could the curriculum's content be enhanced to better address this issue? So two-part question, and so don't forget the second part. So those are some general reminders as you start to write your paper. I think if I'm honest, in terms of all the papers that you write, I think this one is the easiest for teachers and students to write about. But I look forward to reading your papers, and you can certainly contact me if you want to run some of your thinking by me to get a sense that you're on the right track with what you plan to write about. Yeah. The good news is you're almost done. You can see the finish line, so keep up the hard work, and I look forward to your papers and your continued discussions in the threads. Thanks. Talk to you soon.